Yes, watch this video indeed, stick with me, because today we are talking about metal and theory. Yes, how do we apply music theory to metal? I've seen this question a lot during my various excursions online, so I figured why not share my approach to this topic. Let's get started. Intervals, or scales, probably the perfect place to begin any metal theory lesson because a lot of metal is based around the riff. Probably way more so than chords, but more on that later. So, what is an interval and how does it relate to scales? Well, here's the D major scale. And the reason you're looking at a D major scale is because my guitar is in drop D tuning. So using D throughout this video will make things a lot less confusing once we bring in the guitar. Anyway, the numbers you see under the notes are the intervals of the major scale. The major scale is a reference point for most of our music theory terminology. So if you ever hear someone say a flat third or a minor seventh, for example, and you're confused about what that means, well, that just means we take the third or the seventh note of the major scale and lower it a half step. We flatten it a half step. All intervals, perhaps unsurprisingly, have their own characteristics and sounds. Understanding the different intervals is obviously very useful when trying to write music with a certain sound already in mind. This is where knowledge of different scales can really come in handy because having scales to pull from is like having a shortcut to specific sounds. I'm very conscious of this in my own music, and I pull from, let's say, Aeolian or Phrygian all the time if I'm looking for a darker sounding section. It just gives me a place to start and a place to generate and develop ideas from right away. So what can we do if we're looking to make music with this D major scale? How do we turn this into metal? Well, to keep things simple, let's begin by making a riff around some of the notes of the scale. Let's say we use the notes D, the tonic, A, the fifth, and F sharp, the third. And by the way, the tonic, the fifth, and the third are the notes that make up a D major chord or a D major triad. And this will be important later on. Anyway, let's also use E, the second, and C sharp, the seventh. I think I know how we can make a riff out of this. Let's listen. Okay, maybe not that exciting, but it's a good place to start. It's a good launching pad for other parts to interact with. For example, in this riff, we never used the fourth note of the scale, which means that technically this riff could be in either D major or D Lydian. Because if we compare the two scales, we can see that the notes we used are featured in both scales. And the only difference between them is that fourth scale degree. That means that depending on how we see this riff in our song, we can perhaps add another melody on top of it, either vocal or another guitar or something else, and make use of either the natural fourth, the G, or the augmented fourth, the G sharp, depending on what kind of character we want to give to the part. And the cool thing about this kind of metal riffing is that we can basically use whatever intervals we want, regardless of where they belong in a scale, to make cool and unique riffs. As long as we keep repeating that D, the tonic note, it becomes the glue that holds everything together. And of course, I should mention here that using the major scale isn't going to make a riff sound very dark, now is it? So I made another version of the riff using Phrygian instead, and because I know my intervals, I can just quickly change everything from major to Phrygian. Let's have a listen. Now, I said earlier that the tonic, third, and fifth made a D major chord. In the Phrygian example, this was also the case, but since the third was lowered a half step, that gave us a D minor chord, or a D minor triad as part of the riff instead. The fact that our riff contains a whole D minor chord is actually important because it puts us in D minor. Now, depending on the other intervals we play as part of our riff, this can mean Phrygian, it can mean Aeolian, it can mean Dorian, or it can even mean something like Hungarian minor, one of my favorite scales. Because these are all scales based around a D minor tonic. But we can also use this knowledge to turn our riffs into chord progressions. Because since basic chords are made up of three notes, typically triads, we can play the notes of the chords we want to use as part of our riff, outlining a chord progression that way, even if it is note by note. Playing a chord note by note is called an arpeggio, by the way. Let's say we want to follow up on that Phrygian riff and stay in this vague D minor tonality. And let's also say we want to make use of our open D string to keep a consistent sound. Now, how do we solve this? Well, one way to do it is to go to our D minor scale and look for chords that contain the D note, and then invert the chords as we see fit. So aside from D minor, we can try B flat major, because the third of this chord is a D. Another chord we can use is the G minor chord, because the fifth of G is a D. And since I mentioned Dorian earlier when I listed different minor sounds, why not make things a bit more interesting by changing the G minor chord to a G major chord? Because the only difference between D Dorian and D natural minor is the B versus the B flat. This will give us a nice change going from G major to D minor. And if you watched enough of my videos, you know I like that move by now. Let's listen. Next up, I don't really know what to call this one. Yes, my favorite technique, tonic hammering. It's a bit primitive perhaps, but I like it, and I use it a lot. So tonic hammering is when you chug away at the tonic, or perhaps a power chord, and use other elements, other instruments, or a voice to color in that tonic, to give some context and some harmony to the hammer. Here's an example from my own music where I use staccato voices to color in the hammer. And now for the last and final thing I want to cover today, which is soloing. How do we write better solos? What does it mean to play over the changes or to follow the chords? Well, it's quite simple actually. Let's say I'm soloing over D minor, F, and B flat major 7. Those are all chords from D natural minor. Following the chords, following that progression just means that I emphasize the chord notes during each chord during my solo. So when I'm soloing over the D minor chord, I emphasize the D minor triad, D, F, and A. And when it's time for the F chord, I emphasize the notes F, A, and C, my F major triad. And when I play over the B flat major 7 chord, I will focus on B flat, D, F, and A, the chord tones of B flat major 7. This works really well, even for mediocre guitarists like myself. And once you get more comfortable with this and more used to the idea, you can easily add sixths, fourths, seconds, anything to give it that personal touch and really emphasize the color you're going for in your playing. But the basic idea remains. Just follow and emphasize the chord tones. Let's listen to what it sounds like. No, not bye-bye. No, too soon. Way too soon. You haven't even heard all the parts in context yet. And before that, I also want to say a few things about theory. Some things that I would like to clear up, because I see a lot of statements online that are like, according to music theory, or music theory says that, or this is wrong according to music theory, or whatever. Music theory is not some kind of rule book of what you can and can't do. The main purpose of theory, as far as I'm concerned, is communication. Communicating musical ideas, having some kind of shared language around these things. And not only that, but theory makes things a lot quicker. At least for me, that's basically what it is. It's a shortcut to sounds. Having names for things solidifies them. It makes it easier to remember them. If I know what kind of sound I want for a specific part, I will always have at least a few modes or scales that pop up right away, and it saves me so much time. And instead of calling something that evil, kind of dark, cool sounding riff, I can just call it the flat 2 riff. It makes it so much easier and faster. Anyway, here's the song demonstrating all the different concepts we've talked about in today's video. And as always, thank you so much for watching, especially to you who watched all the way till the end here. I really appreciate it. Have a great day wherever you are in the world, and take care. Bye-bye.